Hello everybody and welcome to Sustainable Solutions Corporation, one of our quarterly webinars. I appreciate everybody taking the time to join us here on what hopefully will be a very informational an hour regarding material ingredient reporting and the market drivers and all the different options out there. Just a little bit about myself and Sustainable Solutions. My name is Kara Watson. I am the Corporate Sustainability Project Manager for our corporate sustainability side of the company. We work with a variety of product manufacturers on implementing their sustainability strategies. And this can include a variety of various aspects. But a lot of it deals with developing transparency documentation to meet internal and external demands. But Sustainable Solutions also has a buildings and operations division where we work with design teams and architectural firms and construction projects for building certifications such as LEED or ENERGY STAR, as well as developing building performance and operations improvements. So we really understand the market drivers and the needs from both sides of the coin in terms of the manufacturing as well as the design side. So hopefully we can bring some insight into this topic for you. And this hour, I really want to spend time on just discussing the market drivers as to why we care about ingredient reporting, as well as really focusing in on that LEED credit for version 4, which has caused so much of the drivers behind the market. But there are additional drivers out there, but today we're really going to be focusing in on LEED. If you have questions about other topics regarding this, please feel free to contact me and I can discuss further with you. I do want to talk about certain definitions and concepts of the whole material reporting as well as the health hazards associated in this space, because in order to really understand it, we really need to define and be on the same wavelength with certain terms. As well as I'm going to discuss a variety of options out there, specifically mentioning the LEED credit, but there's going to be a few additional ones that might be relevant to your needs as well. And if you guys have any questions, please type your questions in the question box throughout the hour, and I will either answer them at the end of the hour or I will get back to you on it. So I really want to talk about what's driving this whole transparency movement and the whole material ingredient reporting initiative that's really surfaced over the past few years. Around 2013, give or take a year, about 80 architectural and design firms really started to worry about the liability they could potentially be faced when they claimed they're designing green or sustainable or healthy buildings. And they started worrying about that because they really didn't understand the materials that go into products and the health hazards associated with the products and the materials within those products. And so they were worrying about what was their position and their role in specifying healthy and safe products, and what would happen if they had a hazardous product specified in one of their buildings. So they started sending out these letters to manufacturers to really demand to ask for transparency and start to really investigate the health concerns of the materials and chemicals in building products. And various different building standards, such as LEED version 4 and the Living Building Product Challenge, they now have chemical ingredient reporting attributes within the standard to really help address these concerns. But it's not just the green building standards themselves that are driving material ingredient disclosure. While that is a huge one, various corporations themselves are also playing a role in this space, where Target and Walmart have a priority for different suppliers that do disclose the type of chemicals that are used in their products. And if that information is actually disclosed by their suppliers, they're going to prefer and specify those products over competitors which do not list those materials. And equally now, a lot of customers and consumers out there are really concerned about it. I'm sure all of you have heard of Flint, Michigan, and the unfortunate incident that happened about a year or two ago when there was found a lot of lead content in their water. And I've worked with piping manufacturers, and they've been receiving, and I've been receiving, a lot of questions by citizens in the United States as to why on earth was lead even in these piping systems to begin with when we knew lead was bad. And while there's a lot of different reasons behind that, and there's no one person at fault or one system at fault for that, and it's not just the products themselves, this really has started to shine a spotlight on looking at the health of the materials inside products. And another further example, there are certain corporations that are giving priority and specifications to products that are going into their own building projects. So we have LEED version 4, and we have big retailers like Target and Walmart, and now even companies such as Google, as they expand their office spaces, they set priority to products that do have material ingredient reporting in some aspect, whether it's health product declarations or cradle-to-cradle or green screen analyses. They do set a precedence as to specifying healthy materials inside of their building projects. And so as we look at this LEED material ingredient credit that is found in LEED version 4, however, it is also a pilot credit in LEED version 3, we really need to understand what the purpose and intent of this credit is. And this LEED credit, the whole purpose behind it is to really reward projects that specify materials that have inventoried the chemicals and disclosed the chemicals of building products. And the reason is they then want to start to minimize the use of harmful substances in that building. So option 1 is really the first step of this LEED credit, and that's really just to understand the material ingredients in building products and specify products that do have an understanding of these materials, as well as start to understand the health hazards that are associated with them. And then you get into option 2, which is ingredient optimization, which really then starts to focus on those health hazards and looking at the alternatives to these materials and chemicals and specifying, okay, are these good materials or do they have a potential for harm? And can we optimize these products to have an alternative that have a better and healthier attribute? And then eventually there will be a third option. It is published, however, it's still actually in review by LEED with their technical advisory group as to how to actually approach it, where we then look at the supply chain and how to optimize the supply chain. Because many of you product manufacturers are really at the will of your suppliers to determine what materials are going into your products, because you aren't necessarily specifying every single ingredient that goes into a component that you're purchasing upstream. So before we get started in looking at all of the different options, I wanted to just define some of the language that I'll be using so that everybody is on the same page. The first is inventory, and inventory is basically just getting an understanding and a list of all of the chemicals and substances that are actually within your product. So if you have a complex product such as a chair, you might understand that you have a cushion and maybe a wheel, but you may not actually manufacture or make the wheel or that cushion itself. And you need to work with your suppliers to really identify what chemicals are going into the foam that's going into that cushion on that chair, or what metals are used in the wheel. So really inventorying is really the first step at really just getting an idea of what chemicals are in your product. And then the next step is identifying hazards associated with those substances in your product. And a hazard is a potential human health or an environmental impact that's directly correlated to a substance. Most hazards that are identified through very well-known reputable sources, huge toxicology reviews, multi-panel, industry-wide experts that have come to a conclusion on the hazards of substances. And there are a variety of different lists that you can determine what a hazard is. There's a lot of tools out there that actually streamline the process for us in order to determine these hazards. But a hazard may not necessarily be an immediate threat to human health, to an occupant in a building. So that's where exposure and risk come into play. So exposure is the amount of contact you actually come into that material or substance. And risk is a multiplier, or is the effect of the exposure plus the times the hazard. So what is the actual probability that a hazard will occur based on the exposure levels of a substance? So one example I always like to use is flat glass in a window, where a lot of flat glass actually has arsenic as an additive to help in the manufacturing process. However, arsenic, while it's very hazardous, you're not really exposed to arsenic in the actual glass when it's used in a building project. So your risk of arsenic poisoning is much lower than the actual threat of getting cut on glass. So it's very important to understand that a hazard is not the same as risk in terms of health hazards. And just because you have hazards listed in some of your documents does not mean you're actually at risk of getting that health impact, such as cancer. And the last definition I did want to mention is the CAS number, because a lot of people actually have not heard of the CAS number, which is short for the Chemical Abstract Service Number. And that's basically the social security number, if you will, of a chemical. So chemicals go by a million different names. Depending on who you talk to, what industry you talk to. You could have sodium carbonate or you could have soda ash, depending on which group and industry you're in. So a CAS number helps streamline everything by just putting the same number to all the different nicknames of a chemical. And so that's why we go by the CAS number, so there's no confusion out there. So the material reporting process can be quite complex and complicated, and I'm trying to break it down in like a type of flow. It goes similar to how we defined it. So it goes from inventory to a hazard screening to the exposure and risk. So you first want to inventory your product, and you really want to look at what materials are in your product down to the 1,000 parts per million. The lead version for credit, the first option, focuses at the 1,000 parts per million. The second option looks a little bit further at the 100 parts per million, but for now we're going to focus on 1,000 ppm, which for those in layman's terms, that's 0.1% of the product. And when you're inventorying a material, you not only want to know what materials go into your product, but you want to know why they're going into your product. So as you're developing an inventory, you want, say for example, it's polyurethane foam in that chair cushion. You want to put that it's for the cushion itself. So you truly understand why that ingredient is in there, as well as putting the associated CAS number next to the phrase polyurethane. The next step would then be to identify the hazards by screening them across industry lists. And this is where our different reporting options will come into play, and we'll talk about this a little bit further. But the hazard lists will vary depending on the certification or the method that you choose. But in general, it's a consensus list, a variety from either the US or Europe or international standards. And if you go further beyond the hazard screening, depending on the option that you choose, you can then look at the actual exposure and the risk associated with that exposure. And then even beyond that, you can then design to optimize and design out those hazardous materials. So the various different options that we're going to be talking about today for product manufacturers, as well as architects that will be collecting this information, are the declare label, a manufacturer's inventory, health product declarations. I'll briefly talk about GREENSCREEN because it's mentioned in most of the other options, as well as Cradle to Cradle and UL Environment's new product lens. So I first want to talk about the declare label, as this was just recently accepted by the USGBC as a way to provide information for option 1 of that lead credit for material ingredient reporting. The declare label is also accepted by the Living Building Challenge, and is actually the only label accepted for the Living Building Challenge if you are trying to get your projects in that building standard. But it's developed by a group called the International Living Future Institute, and it basically is like a food or nutrition label for a product here. So it's very simplified and should be pretty easy to understand, where it does have some VOC emissions data if you have it, depending on the type of product you are, and it discloses all of the materials out to the 1,000 parts per million, or the 0.01% of a product. And this is a self-disclosed label that you to the Living Building Challenge. However, you can get this third-party certified, and they are working with LBC on that pilot right now. The label is only valid for 12 months, so you do have to renew it every year. And there's 3 different status designations. You have declared, meaning you've declared the substances in your product. You have Living Building Challenge compliant, and you have the Living Building Challenge red list free. And so these various attributes really express for a specifier in the Living Building Product Challenge which way to go. So with the declare label, the Living Building Challenge does have a red list of, I believe it's about 200 chemicals, where if you have more than, I believe it's 1% of that material in your product, you cannot be considered Living Building Challenge compliant or red list free. However, there are exceptions to this in terms of market drivers. For example, if building code demands that you have a material that is on that red list, sometimes they do make exceptions depending on the circumstance. So the pros and cons of having the declare label, they do have set prices, which is nice on publishing. It's about $850 per product, but they streamline the costs as you develop more products for the certification. And it's very easy to read, and it's used for 2 different building standards, which is nice. However, it is only valid for 1 year, which means constant renewal. And one of the big issues is when you are working with your suppliers on getting this information, a lot of your suppliers do not want to disclose their proprietary ingredients, because most of your suppliers think they have found the golden ticket and that secret sauce that really makes their product better than their competitors, and they will not disclose this. And there's really no way to get around the proprietary ingredients above 1%. You have to really be able to disclose everything in that product, which can be challenged depending on what type of materials and products you're producing. And also, products that do have substances on the red list, you can't actually obtain the declare label. I believe they do have exceptions for less than 1%, but as I've mentioned before, if market demands that red list chemicals are required, such as having like a flame retardant, you can make exceptions. And here's one example of an exception of a material, and you can see it's much lower than 1% of it being a proprietary ingredient. And it is a Living Building Challenge compliant and not red list free, and that's because an exception was made based on the market. A manufacturer's inventory is another option, and that's a self-declared option. You're not actually posting it on any other website. It's not being certified or developed by any standards beyond yourself. So a lot of times you don't see that out on the market very often because there's no third-party verification required of it. That does not mean you cannot get it third-party verified to validate that you are disclosing all of your information. But a manufacturer's inventory is basically just a publicly available disclosure of all of the chemicals in your product. And you have to disclose down to the 1,000 parts per million per the LEED version 4 credit, and that is per weight or per mass of a product. And if you do have proprietary ingredients that you need to disclose or that you cannot disclose, you have to disclose the role of the proprietary ingredient, and if that material has a GREENSCREEN benchmark or a global harmonization standard classification hazard. The GHS just very recently did an international collaboration between a variety of different organizations to streamline the material safety data sheets so that hazards across global standards will be uniform. So a lot of times the US OSHA versus Europe had various different requirements, and now GHS has a new classification and labeling of these chemicals and hazards. So you can use that for this as well. The cost is free because it is self-declared. If you do want it third-party verified by an outside party, it might cost you a couple $1,000s, maybe towards the higher end of $10,000, depending on what exactly your product is. However, it is free. However, it will take a lot of internal efforts and internal costs to develop this, to get information from your supplier if you do not have it. So some of the pros is that you do not actually have to disclose the chemical. Unlike the declared label, which we did just review, you have a proprietary threshold of 1%. So you can actually just disclose the GREENSCREEN benchmarks instead of just disclosing the CAS number, which can be a pro if you have a supplier not willing to provide you information. And you don't need to do any hazard screenings unless if it is a proprietary ingredient. You just need to disclose the actual CAS numbers of each material. And it can be, there's no external cost, so it can be considered free. However, a con, downside is that it does require more internal work. So if you do have an overloaded staff, it might be difficult to move forward with getting all of this information and getting it out on time. And it does require your suppliers to actually disclose substances to you, which can be a big effort and a big cause of concern for some of your suppliers based on trade secrets and efforts. And the third option that I really want to take time to talk about is health product declarations. Health product declarations, or HPDs, have been out for about 3 or 4 years now, and have really been gaining momentum since LEED version 4 started talking about the HPDs. HPDs are developed, there's a standard out there developed by the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, the HPDC, which is a nonprofit organization which is focused on just getting material ingredient reporting out there to decision makers. And the HPD reports all of the product contents as well as it screens all of these contents against roughly 32, give or take a few lists, hazard lists out there. Some are US, some are European, some are international. There's quite a number. But they also use the GreenScreen list translator to help generate these hazards, and I will go into that a little bit further in a few minutes. But this standard, there was a version 1 which was to disclose all intentionally added materials. However, version 2 was released this past September, which changed the content threshold to be all intentional ingredients of a product down to the 1,000 parts per million level, which is similar to that lead credit of the 1,000 parts per million that you see. So now there's a little bit more consistency. So the version 2 standard was released in September. However, the builder itself was not released until February of this year. But the builder does streamline the process a lot in that the HPD is developed through a standardized template so that all HPDs look the same. You just need to input your CAS numbers and your percentages and identify the role in which each of these ingredients play in your product, and then everything will be consolidated into one nice document. So expanding upon looking at what an HPD is, here you can see blown up you have your ingredient name and the CAS number identifying it if you're not familiar with the actual term that they use, as well as the amount in the product, if it's a green screen list translator, if it has a benchmark or not, as well as it does have room for recycled content, if it's a nanoparticle or uses nanotechnology, and as well as what the role is in the product. And if there are any hazards found on any of the lists, it will list them here. The nice thing about HPDs is that they do have a note section under each substance, which can explain if there's any discrepancies or confusions out there. You can explain if, for example, if the hazard itself is not going to pose any risk to the consumer. So the nice thing with HPDs is that you can have multiple products in one HPD if you have a product line. The threshold is 10% by weight. If your products are within 10% by weight of similar and have the same types of components, you can put them in one HPD, otherwise you have to split them out. And the percentage range is nice too, as if your suppliers are concerned about proprietary formulations, you can have them put a percentage range instead to help protect their actual formulation. They do allow you to discuss some other relevant certifications such as VOC testing. In fact, VOC testing is required for wet applied products in the HPD. You do need to have that information in order to publish. And you can publish even further below the 1,000 parts per million if you so choose to. And an important aspect of the HPD is that for proprietary ingredients, you do not actually have to disclose the name and CAS number of proprietary ingredients. What you do have to disclose are the health hazards associated with them. And so when working with your suppliers, you can have them actually work in the HPD tool to identify what hazards are triggered with using those CAS numbers, and they can provide you a list of those hazards so that you cannot identify what ingredients go into the product. However, you can still disclose those hazards according to the standard. And HPD version 2 is nice because you can also disclose all of the substances per individual components of your product. So if we are making a chair, for example, you can categorize everything by saying you have cushion, and within the cushion you can have, you know, your foam and your additives, in your pigments or so, and then you can have your wheel or your frame as a separate component so that everything is orderly and you can understand it a little bit easier. One of the big cons or drawbacks to the HPDs is that it still is hazard-based and does not take into account any exposures. And so a lot of times you'll see materials which could be very small parts of the process or of your product, and you could see a cancer warning on there or a respiratory impact warning on there. And get concerned that people will think you have a toxic product when in fact there's zero exposure risk to that hazard. And so that can be a drawback depending on the type of product and material that you have. And also with the HPD version 2 standard, the standard does lack guidance at the current moment on certain special conditions. Certain materials such as glass and ceramics and alloyed metals do not have the same risk associated with the materials inside embedded in them compared to other products. And at the current moment, they don't have guidance yet on how to disclose these materials and substances in these materials. They are working on that. There are subgroups out there that are trying to define this guidance, but until then, there really isn't much guidance on it. And at the current moment, with the lead version 4 ruling on including the HPD standard version 2, they don't roll out the percentages for each ingredient in the overall product. If you have an ingredient used in just one component, you can see the percent in that actual component of the product, but you don't actually see, okay, so that component then goes into the overall product, and it doesn't carry that calculation through yet. That is being worked on by the HPDC, and hopefully we will have a way to portray that, that percentage in the overall product, but at the current moment it doesn't. And the tool is new, and so sometimes there are kinks with working with it, and I believe there's slight issues right now with the disclosure levels being marked. And for different materials, you can have multiple disclosure levels checked, and there's some issues with like the copyright and trademark things in the titles of the document. So there are still some kinks, and the HPDC strongly encourages you, if you notice them, to please report it to them so that they can fix it. And third-party verification of HPDs are still pending. The pilot process, I believe, hopefully will be starting in June, but I have not heard word in the past month or two on that. But you cannot be third-party verified yet of your health product declaration. And so if you're worried about misinformation out there and you want that extra verification step, that is still pending. Okay. So I've mentioned of this green screen, and I've talked briefly about GREENSCREEN list translator. So I do want to very briefly talk about this because it's a very complex subject, but it does come up a lot in a lot of different options here. And so GREENSCREEN is a chemical assessment which really looks at the hazards and identifies chemicals of high concern. And it can also, if you get a full assessment, it can also help identify some safer alternatives to the chemical that you're using. So the list translator itself is based only on published hazard lists. So it looks at probably 80 or more hazard lists published throughout the world, and it combines them all and looks at all of the studies that are out there and basically puts health hazards and impacts and rates them from high concern to low concern on the hazards, and basically puts a benchmark weighting on it. Many different reporting, such as the HPD, manufacturer's inventory, they do use the GREENSCREEN list translator to help identify different impacts. And if you do search the list translator for different benchmarks and you don't have any benchmarks of very high concern, then you can go for the option 2, which is the optimized credit, meaning you have a safer or an optimized product down to the 1,000 parts per million. So GREENSCREEN basically looks at all the different materials and chemicals that go into a product And I want to specifically say that GREENSCREEN looks at chemicals. It does not look at the overall product itself. So you have to look at the actual different, by substance level, all the different chemicals that go into your product, even though some of the chemicals may interact with each other for the overall product and be inert. So that is one of the drawbacks to GREENSCREEN, in that it is a chemical-only material analysis. But GREENSCREEN looks at all of the hazards, and it basically assesses, based on different criteria, which materials are safe and which ones have high concern. And they look at 18 different health hazards and environmental hazard endpoints, such as cancer, mutagens, reproductive effects, acute aquatic impacts or chronic aquatic impacts, as well as if the material itself is persistent in the environment, if it's bioaccumulative in the environment, and if it's reactive and toxic within it. And it basically looks at all of the studies or all of the hazard lists out there and assigns a benchmark level, where benchmark 1 is chemicals to avoid, or chemicals of very high concern or high concern. And then benchmark 4 is the lower, which is a safer chemical, meaning that they're a safer chemical, meaning less likely to cause harm. So benchmarks 1 are the ones to avoid versus 4. Sometimes that can be confusing because the higher the number, the better the material, which can get confusing. And then benchmark 2s are kind of in between. They're still, they can be used, but you still want to search for safer alternatives, as well as benchmark 3s. You have an opportunity to improve your product, but they don't pose as great of a risk. With GREENSCREEN, you do have the list translator, which only looks at hazard lists, but you can actually run a full assessment on the chemical of interest. So by using the GREENSCREEN list translator, you can identify which materials might be triggered as a high concern, and then conduct a full assessment on those chemicals. And so the full assessment itself will look at the material and will include a lot of other studies in addition to those hazard lists before applying a full benchmark score on that product. So there could be, say you have a material that could be a list translator benchmark 1, but if you run it through a full assessment, it could actually be considered lower, depending on various studies. So the actual full assessment can be fairly pricey. I believe costs on this can range depending on how many materials you're looking at. And so depending on costs, I won't give those out now, but if you do have questions on that, you can contact me. So the benefits of the list translator is that it is just a tool. You can access them through various vendors, and it requires very little expertise. You just really need to know your CAS number or the product name or material name, and be able to run those hazard lists. And it's really good at just identifying known hazardous chemicals, but it doesn't necessarily identify unknown hazardous chemicals or safe chemicals. So just because you run a CAS number through the list translator and it doesn't come up, doesn't necessarily mean it's safe because it's not on those hazard lists. It could also be that it hasn't been tested fully, or it's a new material that hasn't been thoroughly screened yet and hasn't made it onto those hazard lists. So there is some unknown to not receiving any hazardous warnings on there. And it doesn't really evaluate product, like transformation products, like furniture products or a full product itself. It really just looks at the chemicals. But the GREENSCREEN assessment, if you do go forward with doing the full assessment versus the list translator, it can actually identify safe materials, but it does require a decent amount of expertise and time. And if you do have a certified green screen assessment, any of those results do trump the list translator results because you do have a professional toxicologist looking at those chemicals to actually determine what those hazards are and those risks are. Okay. So moving on to cradle to cradle. Cradle to cradle certification is actually a multi-attribute certification. This looks at a variety of different aspects in addition to just the material health. So I'm going to be honing in on the material health, but it is worth briefly talking about the various other ones. So cradle to cradle does not just look at the ingredients, but it looks at how the product itself is made, what the water consumption is, if you're using any renewable energy, and the social aspects of it. And it takes all of these attributes and it basically puts a certification level, sort of like a lead building project level, on a product. So it just basically gives you a cradle-to-cradle basic certification or bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. It doesn't give you much more information to the public. They do provide you the manufacturer reports on information on it, but to the actual published result is just a certification. But with the whole initiative behind material health, Cradle to Cradle has just honed in on that first category of material ingredients and really assesses all the material ingredients within a product. So it doesn't require as big of an effort on the various other categories for data collection. And to get a material health certificate with Cradle to Cradle, that certification begins at the bronze level instead of your basic certified level. Cradle to Cradle can be costly. It's at a minimum, it's $2,600 just to obtain the certificate, but there's an also additional cost for the product assessment. And depending on how complex that product assessment is, it could range anywhere between maybe $6,000 to like $15,000, depending on how many ingredients are in your product and how complex your product is. But the material health certificate itself basically characterizes all of the materials and it identifies the potential hazards, but it also runs an assessment on those hazards of those substances. And there is a red list or a banned chemicals list associated with Cradle to Cradle. They have identified certain materials that they feel are quite hazardous either to the environment or to material health or human health, where if a product does contain those materials, then you cannot obtain that certification because they are considered problematic. But the nice thing about Cradle to Cradle is that it is just a certification, just a flat bronze, silver, platinum, gold certification. They do not actually list out the material ingredients in your product. So if you do have hesitations regarding proprietary ingredients or even ranges of your product ingredients, this is a favorable option for you. And it does look holistically at the product life. It does look at some of the manufacturing impacts of these ingredients as well as the disposal impacts of the product as well when it's making these assessment calls on the ingredients. And there are some exceptions to exposure in regarding to the hazards with human health when it comes to marketplace and different scenarios that they can certify you to. And it is a third-party certified document, which for certain like for example the Google Portico system, certain initiatives do favor the third-party certification higher than a self-declared label. Cradle to cradle can be expensive depending on your budget, and they do have that banned substance list, which depending on the type of material and product you have can prevent you from actually obtaining that certification. And just briefly, I do want to talk about UL Environment's product lens. This is a new material disclosure technique, which is being launched in June. So it is quite new on the market, but I do think it is a very interesting option, and I did want to mention it as it does gain traction out there. And it's currently wrapping up its pilot phase with a few manufacturers, but UL had developed this certificate with a variety of manufacturers as well as architects and designers to really seek out what were the actual transparency needs for LEED version 4, as well as what were the needs and the actual desires of the architecture community. And they really wanted to present that information, which was still understandable, but it still put the risks and exposures that the manufacturers were concerned about in a platform that shows that there's risk for the consumer, well, or it could be risk for the consumer depending. So it looks at it almost more like a life cycle perspective in terms of the manufacturing stage, the use phase of the product, and the end of life stage, instead of just giving it a hazard screening. So it really helps show what each stage where that risk is. So I want to just show you just real briefly what this new certificate is going to look like. You do receive a certification mark, as well as a short, like 3 to 4 page document on all of the materials in your product, as well as the rankings of the hazard list or the risk of the chemicals in your product to human health. And there is a background health assessment report that is delivered to the product manufacturer to discuss future optimization. And I do like Product Lens in that it is very visual, using like the traffic light, red, yellow, green light type of hazards to really show where those hazards and those risks are in there. So you can see here it does disclose your materials and your CAS number. It includes the role and it includes the percent in the product. But then the result gives you a hazard rating of problematic, a middle, and then a low hazard rating with some comments on there. Because this still is in a pilot phase, and it is just a new one, it is going to be relatively expensive at the moment as they do work on streamlining this process. But one of the pros is that it does look very holistically at each life cycle stage. And as a life cycle practitioner, personally, I like being able to understand what the risks are at each step of the product instead of just being able to get just a one named hazard. Because if you look at like a window, for example, you might have arsenic in your flat glass because of the manufacturing phase, but you're not going to get arsenic poisoning when you're standing next to a window during the use of that glass. And so I do enjoy seeing those different stages communicated to the actual consumer itself. And it is very visual, but unfortunately for the manufacturer, if you do have some more hazardous ingredients in there, then that can be a risk communicating that information to the consumers. Okay. And I want to close with just talking about a case study where a cable manufacturer, Superior Ethics, had material disclosure as well as EPDs for a lot of their cable products. And they have actually, because they have it, and they were one of the first in their industry to have this material disclosure documentation, they've won 6 significant projects just over this last year due to having this transparency documentation. And material ingredient disclosure this isn't going away. In fact, I think it's going to be even increasing in terms of demand out in the market. And not just in the green building world, I think it's going to cover a lot of other products out there too. Just like I mentioned with Flint, Michigan, I think consumers are now really going to start questioning what is in all of the products that they use and are they safe. So it's not going away. And one of the another important thing is that you're really going to have to start engaging with your suppliers and start collaborating with them on what are good strategies for disclosing this information to the public. Because the ultimate goal is to understand what the effects are to consumers using your products, and also how can we optimize them and make them better. So supplier engagement is very key for completing this initiative. And each material option out there has drawbacks and benefits. Some are more costly, but at the same time, those costs do assess the actual hazards associated. So if you are worried with having some hazards, you might want to put in that extra effort to have an assessment done on those risks. And those internal and external costs with your company will play a major factor in deciding which pathway is best for you. And each manufacturer is going to be unique in understanding which is best for your company. And with that, I'm going to go to the Windows pane and see if there has been any questions submitted. So there's one question that says, what is the 0.01% based on? And it is weight. So with each ingredient reporting option, you are reporting per weight, because we do live in a world that believes in the conservation of mass. And so we will be reporting by percent by mass or weight and not volume. So this is also in the lead credit. Their 1,000 ppm and 100 ppm, depending on which option, is based on mass, as well as each individual standard itself too. Then can you clarify, are we looking at chemicals going into the product or actual exposure to the customer? So depending on which option you're going with, if you're going with a manufacturer's inventory, you are looking at just the chemicals going into the product. You are not looking at necessarily the chemicals being used in the manufacturing process, just whichever chemicals are in your product. Some of the options do take it further and do analyze the exposure and the risk to the customer to help provide that extra clarity on whether or not there is an actual hazard related to it. So it really depends on which option you go with, but at a minimum, the declare label on manufacturer's inventory and the HPD look at the chemicals going into the product. Okay, so I have a question on the HPD range with the percentages. So the HPD, the Health Product Declaration Standard, does allow for a % range of each substance in a product. I believe the absolute maximum range you can have without making a note is 20% of each ingredient in your product. But you can have for each, there's 2 different aspects here. So you can put a range for each ingredient, which can help with proprietary formulations. A lot of suppliers, having worked with the supply chain, are afraid that their secret ingredients and proportions will be be found out, for lack of a better explanation, and their edge in the market will be lost. So that range does help with proprietary ingredients and help mitigate any risk with the supplier. But you can also put multiple products in one HPD if the products are similar. And that range is only 10%. So if you have a product line that doesn't change very much, you can lump those products together in one HPD if by 10% by weight that variance exists or less. So I have a question that says, as a steel manufacturer, they're heavily invested in lead reporting for recycled content and regionality, but they want to maintain a presence with lead v4. If they had to pick a reporting method, which would lend itself to be most fruitful for contributing to lead version 4? So that gets tricky depending on the manufacturer and what type of information you have. So with the lead material ingredient reporting credit, these options that we have listed all do contribute towards that option 1 in some aspect or another. So depending on if you can just disclose your ingredients down to the 1,000 parts per million with the role and the function, you can contribute towards that ingredient. And I am not here to say which one is better or which one is worse. That's really dependent upon you as a manufacturer itself. If you have worries about proprietary ingredients, you might want to go with one of the certifications that allow you to have different options on how to portray those proprietary ingredients. And if you want to go even further down to option 2 and disclose down to the 100 parts per million, you can start looking at your cradle-to-cradle certifications, but also see if you have any benchmarks or if you lack of benchmarks, really, to avoid those benchmark ones in GREENSCREEN. So I am not here to really determine for you which option is best. But if you want to talk further about that, feel free to send me a note, and I'll be glad to help you determine that pathway for you. So I have a question on the average cost of a health product declaration. So for an HPD, to maintain an account with the HPD Collaborative, you do, in order to publish one, you do have to either become a member, which is $1,500, or purchase tokens, which are $500 for every 5 HPDs you purchase. So at a minimum, it will be $500 to $1,500. You can develop HPDs internally, which can reduce these external costs. For if you do hire a consultant to help collect data from your suppliers and really organize information, it can really range anywhere between maybe $7,000 upwards to $20,000, depending on how complex your product is. And it also really depends on how many suppliers you maintain and how willing your suppliers are to give you that information. Okay. And with that, I believe we are just about out of time. We will be providing slides and a recording of this this presentation to those that have signed up and have attended. So please look for that too, because I do see some questions on that. So thank you everybody for attending, and I look forward to our next webinar.